When I was 5 years old, my 3 siblings and I left our dinner on the table and followed the sound of my father's scream downstairs. We stopped short at the scene of my mother's suicide. The night she hung herself, my mom must have decided that her life had no worth, and I decided, as a child does, that her decision must have been because of me. I would spend the next 3 decades of my life telling myself versions of, if I was good enough, horrible things wouldn't happen. My incessant obligation to improve myself ran me like a junkie. This became my own personal prison. In my 20s, I married, and I had my first son, and then a second, and a third, and I promptly put myself into a parenting class that introduced me to something called the Enneagram. An incisive psychological tool, the Enneagram is taught at places like Stanford and Harvard. It showed me that people's neurological organization is so patterned we're actually predictable, like a map of ego structures. This curious 9-pointed diagram pointed out the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral strategies we all use to survive our childhoods. I very reluctantly recognized myself as an Enneagram Type 1, the perfectionist, reformer, whose habit it is to suppress anger and reframe it into something more appropriate. We're utopian at heart, but Type 1s forget that our goodness is inherent, not earned, and we set standards for ourselves and others that leave us eternally idealistic and chronically frustrated. For the first time, I understood that the contempt I held for myself was directly related to my fury at the world for abandoning me when my mother disappeared from my life. I could temporarily suppress my outrage by staying above and beyond my own reproach until my ego caught up to me with its self-critical judgment and seething resentment. There was nothing wrong with me, as it turns out, just an intelligent response to a massive hurt and my fierce compulsion to avoid it. Slowly, I began to realize that in 9 different ways, we all come to suffer that we're not enough, not good enough, not special enough, not successful enough, not unique enough, not masterful enough, loyal, happy, strong, or loved enough. This is the human condition. I wish I could tell you that's when I became enlightened. But I wouldn't find any lasting reprieve from my inner critic until almost 10 years later, when I found myself in a little Texas prison. As a newly certified Enneagram teacher, face to face with about 100 guys who were in for everything from drug dealing to murder. I was hired to teach something that I believed, but I had yet to really learn, that we're all in a prison of our own making and the way that we suffer our personalities. I would spend months stressing myself over the men I was about to meet, projecting myself right onto them by imagining that they would be too broken, too damaged, too hurting, too angry to get it. The US prison system gave me a convenient metaphor from my own shadow side, where I could unconsciously take all the stuff I couldn't stand about myself and dump it onto an entire population of already hurting men. I wouldn't get away with that for long. The men that I met behind bars were nothing like I imagined. They were so grateful that someone came, and they were starving to know the truth about themselves. They shocked me with their transparency and what they were willing to admit to having done, and also what they shared with me happened to them during their childhoods. As I stood in front of a sea of men in blue uniforms who reminded me of my own children, a little part of me sat among them, arms folded, foot tapping, waiting for those tough guys to drop their defense mechanisms, waiting for them to find their vulnerability. And then they did. And I suddenly found myself up against my own ego structure in ways that I did not anticipate and I did not like. Sitting with people at the unhealthy rock bottom of themselves as we found our breath and we located an inner witness to ourselves in a place like prison was a miracle, because their practice of self-sabotage and self-hatred and self-abandonment, I sheepishly realized, were also mine. Years of therapy and Healers and self-help books and workshops couldn't rival the extraordinary journey inward I received from sitting in that prison with those men over the next 4 years. They showed me that my story of being not good enough was a tired one. And what a fraud I would be if I failed to take my own teaching, the teaching of the Enneagram, to heart. Right in front of me, those hurting men were waking up to who they were, and as they did, they literally held space for me to do the same. Traditionally, the Enneagram has been taught in privileged white esoteric circles, but it has always been meant for everyone. In 2012, I founded a nonprofit called Enneagram Prison Project in order to bring this self-awareness tool to the people who seem to need it the most. Together with a dedicated team, a small but dedicated team, we've been teaching the Enneagram in California at progressive facilities like Santa Clara County and San Mateo County Jail and San Quentin State Prison. People told us, you can't teach that thing to them. They're going to manipulate you with it. But that's not what happens. I'll tell you what does. When we give people this incisive psychological tool and the loving support they need to unpack what happened to them, people who have been practically thrown away, warehoused, who have all but discarded themselves, do what hardly anyone believes is even possible to do. They begin to heal. Historically, our approach to correcting bad behavior in the US has been to punish, but punishment alone doesn't work. We know this because we've seen a 700% increase in incarceration over 30 years in this country. Nearly 1 in 100 Americans is behind bars. 67% of them will return to prison within 3 years. We've been tough on crime, and we've waged a war on drugs, but the human beings targeted in our campaigns are already among the most hurting members of our society. We put them in prisons more destructive than the lives they were living, and then hate them for not changing when they get out. Every one of the women in our maximum security classes has been raped, many of them before age 10. Most of the men in custody have lost their fathers through violence, death, incarceration, or abandonment, mostly before they were teens. Physical, sexual, and emotional abuse for men and women is so normalized that people list off tortures they've lived through, not even comprehending the degree of emotional loss they've suffered. And the majority of men and women in prison are in for drug-related offenses. Dr. Gabor Mate, the Canadian-Hungarian physician who specializes in addiction, says the most pressing question is not why the addiction, but rather, why the pain? Our system is broken, and so are the people in it. Author Henry Cloud says, we begin to change when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing. We've come by our reputation as the country that incarcerates more people than any other nation by perpetuating a system that has long since failed those it aims to correct. We need to hold people compassionately culpable for what has gone wildly wrong on both sides of the bars, for those locked up in our correctional system and for those of us running it. But we cannot change what we cannot see. We must be willing to take a look at what is actually really going on the inside of jails and prisons, on the inside of family systems, and inside of ourselves. A man named John self-selected into our 8-week program at the local jail 18 months ago. Jacked up, tattoos everywhere, awaiting court and looking at some serious time. He picked a type overnight in his cell with an Enneagram book, type 3. The performer, the achiever. He got to work on himself immediately. Type 3s are known for their hustle, for being the best, for being successful. But John owned the hardest, most defended part of his type, the chameleon-like deceit and the violent aggression for anyone who got in the way of his big self-image, and the tough mask that he wore, all of which we helped him to realize were his good cover for a very hurting heart. For John, prison began in utero. He was born to a coke-addicted mother and a father who would show up sporadically to beat his family and have sex with his mother in front of the children. Little John protested by ruining his mom's high every chance he got, hiding her drugs, being a menace, starving for attention. When John was only 4 years old, his pregnant mother went to prison, and John was sent to foster care, where he was violently and repeatedly raped for years by 2 older foster care kids with a knife to his throat. He was beaten often until he was hospitalized. When John's mom was released from prison, he was returned to her care, so full of hate and rage he could barely contain himself. When he was 9, he found his mom's stash of crystal meth and instantly escaped his childhood. When John was 12, he came upon his father, beating his mother nearly to death. In her defense, he saw red and he beat his father into a 6-month coma with a baseball bat. John was charged with assault with a deadly weapon and spent the rest of his childhood locked up in juvenile hall until he was 18. How we hold ourselves together when things outside of us are falling apart is learned in childhood. How much presence we can tolerate is directly related to the relationship to nurture we had when we were small. For John, nurture is non-existent. The scariest part of his childhood were his own parents. Under that kind of terror, our reptilian brain signals us to fight, to flee, or to freeze. It's the only guardian we have. It's the only thing we come to trust. We teach students like John, and there are thousands of inmates like John, that what happened to him was not his fault. As the famous English psychologist D.W. Winnicott says, things that happened during childhood should never have happened, and things that should happen did not. Things like love and nurture and holding. But we also teach that the holding that he did not receive, it is possible for him to learn to do for himself now. We taught him of the intelligence behind his instinct to fight, to survive, to be seen, of the radiance we still see in him, and that his capacity to be as whole as he hopes to become is undiminished. And then we watched as tears filled his eyes, and John set a goal to transform his life. I founded Enneagram Prison Project on a leap of faith, naively believing that if we could just help people to see the patterns of their personality, they would be freed to make new choices. Over the last 8 years, working with some of the best teachers in the field, I've come to see that this is only partially true. Learning the personality is a big part of the puzzle, but trauma resolution and recovering the emotional losses of childhood are the others. Adverse childhood experiences can impair the very architecture of the brain with negative effects that can last a lifetime. Actually, a prison made for us in childhood is not our choice at all. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's leading trauma experts, says, being traumatized is to continue to organize your life in such a way as if the trauma were still going on, as if every new encounter were contaminated by the past. Our work is about helping people to excavate the highest parts of themselves from the lowest places in their past. We need prisons. John posed a real threat to society, and he needed to be contained. I have had many people tell me, going to prison saved my life. But John was not born violent or evil. No child is. Human beings do not come into the world as murderers and rapists, home invaders and gang leaders, addicts and thieves. These roles are fostered inside families. Where were we when John was only 4 years old? How we live out our adulthoods is eventually and ultimately our responsibility, but we need to come clean to our own negligence in failing to give children the chance they so desperately deserve to ever learn how to do this. What we do with children when they end up in our custody, in our care, is our responsibility. Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, said, in order for people to grow, they must be held in unconditional positive regard. The people in custody are not even allowed to hug. During intake, when they're booked, they're put into a cold, concrete room called a holding tank. People can spend all day there and entire lifetimes in prison without a single human being ever helping them to understand how to hold their pain. Imagine if our correctional system were to add healing to its charter. What if we all started asking, because we all started caring, what has happened to you that led you here? Tell me about your childhood. John has been sent to prison. He's scheduled to get out in 2036. How the time served in his tortured childhood does not somehow count in his overall sentencing is confounding. John has a 1-year-old daughter. He will experience her entire childhood from behind bars. When the prison door clanged closed behind him, John fell to his knees and sobbed, thinking he would lose his mind. But then, he heard this little voice inside of his head say, "Can you be okay?" And then, in the most counter-instinctual move of his lifetime, John sat down in that prison cell and he took a breath. The people that we least expect to change are waking up to the pain inside of themselves, ending generational cycles of incarceration, one person, one pod, one prison at a time. The rest of us need to wake up too. Impacting a pattern of this epic proportion requires a radical, massive paradigm shift in consciousness, a shift in caring. Self-scrutiny must happen on both sides of the bars. We need not insist that the incarcerated bear the brunt of our collective healing. Actually, the incarcerated are among the most powerful, willing agents of human transformation that exist. On a spiritual level, their healing lifts the collective. But in the most practical sense, their healing is for the protection of society as a whole. The way they went in was bad enough. Enneagram Prison Project's compassionate application of the loving Enneagram system allows people to leave prison better off than where they started. We all benefit from this kind of expansion, and I know now without a doubt, they are the ones who deserve it.